Okay, now we're talking about champagne, the king and queen of all sparkling wines. Champagne is something more and more people know, but it's worth reminding people. Champagne is a sparkling wine, but not all sparkling wine is champagne. A lot of people use champagne like they use the word Xerox or Kleenex. They use it as a generic term for sparkling wine, and it's not. The only thing that theoretically should be called champagne comes from this red area of France right here. If the grapes aren't grown there, even if they're grown in other parts of France, it should not be called champagne. As I mentioned before, it's a northerly location. You really can't make a still wine there because the still wine won't ripen enough. So they sort of invented sparkling wine so they could have some wine with their food. If you've been to some of the other classes, you know that the reason that wine and beer got invented in the first place was because the water wasn't safe to drink. So by fermenting things, it purified the water so that they could have something to drink. But it got so popular in Champagne, they started making sparkling wines in even areas that were warm enough to make still wine. So what started out as a necessity became a preference. We talked about that, and we talked about that already. So in order to be called champagne, technically it should come from that area right there. This is a map of Champagne. We're not going to get into the characteristics of the different subregions, but they have different subregions that the grapes are harvested from. And very often you'll see one or two of the subregions on the labels. Allowable grapes in Champagne. You're allowed Pinot Noir. It's a red grape with red fruit flavors. Chardonnay, a white grape with floral and citrus flavors. And Pinot Noir, which is a red grape with light fruit flavors. If you say, hey, Gasper, but my champagne, how can it have any Pinot Noir in it? Because it's a white wine. Well, the reason for that is they don't give it any, for those white champagnes, they don't give it any skin contact. And since wine gets its color from the skins, not from the juice, you could still use the juice from a red grape and make a white wine. Most champagnes is a blend of the three. But those that aren't have some special names. One is a Blanc de Blanc. If you ever see that on a label of champagne, it means that it's made from 100% Chardonnay. So you'll get the fruity characteristics of Chardonnay. If you see a Blanc de Noirs, it means it's only Pinot Noir and Pinot Noir. It's only made from red grapes. And if you get a rosé, they either expose it to the grape skins for a period of time, or in Champagne, they allow you to mix up to 20% of a still red wine into the champagne in order to make it a rosé. So in Champagne, they use both methods, skin contact and by blending in a little red wine to make rosé champagne. So that's how they make that there. You'll also see some village classifications on champagne bottles. A village is an area where the grapes are used to produce some, champagne are grown. There's over 300 unique villages in Champagne. Each village is rated on a 100-point system. So they go in, they look at the soil, they look at the aspect, they look at all characteristics of the vineyards, and they rate it on a 100-point system. Villages that score a perfect 100, and there's 17 of them, are allowed to put the words Grand Cru on their labels. So if you look through a rack of champagne, the ones that say Grand Cru had 100% of the grapes used to make that particular champagne come from one of these Grand Cru vineyards. Villages that score between 90 and 99, and there's 42 of the 300, are allowed to put the words Premier Cru on their label. So if you see Premier Cru, It's going to be one of that wine comes from one or more of these vineyards that scored between 90 and 99. That's not necessarily an indication of quality, because the winemaker can then manipulate those wines. So there are some so-so wines that come from classified villages, and there's some outstanding wines that come from unclassified village. But it's sort of like insurance. It gives you a clue as to what the quality is. It doesn't necessarily give you a guarantee as to what the quality is. There's just a few things you can tell by looking at a champagne label. First of all, if it says champagne, you know it comes from the Champagne region. And nobody else, with one exception, is allowed to use the word champagne on their labels. So you know it's an authentic champagne from the Champagne region, with this one exception. Winemakers like Andre and folks like that called themselves Champagne. So as part of the negotiations, they allow them to use the words California Champagne. Anybody that used the word Champagne in California prior to March 10th, 2006 can still put the words California Champagne on their labels. So that's the only place other than Champagne from Champagne you'll see the word Champagne on a wine label. If you see a year, a vintage on a wine label, it means the winemaker thought that the grapes produced in this particular year were so outstanding that they wanted a bottle of vintage. They don't make a vintage champagne every year. It's up to the winemakers, but if they say, if this is an OMG wine and they think it's outstanding, they will make a vintage wine that year. It's only one of the winemakers. What vintage champagnes must age for a minimum of 3 years with 1 year on the lees. Most of them extend that. So if you have a vintage champagne, it has to spend at least a year resting with the dead yeast, and it's got to stay in the bottle after that for a minimum of 3 years before it can get sold. Non-vintage champagne is a blend of different years so that the producer can create a house style. If you have the standard Veuve Clicquot, if you have the standard non-vintage Veuve Clicquot, they don't want you to care what year it is. They want it to taste the same year after year after year. But because the wine they make every year is different, they have to blend different years together in order to create that flavor profile. So the rules for non-vintage champagnes is they must age for a minimum of 15 months with at least 1 year on the lees. And most people extend that period of time. And also, this is only tonight, anybody, you have to sign a non-disclosure agreement. There's also a super secret code that tells you a lot about how this wine was made on a wine label. Y'all promise not to tell anybody? Okay. If you'll notice on this label, there's this little NM here. That's a clue to tell you how this wine was made. An NM means negotiant manipulant. It's made by large producers that buy grapes from throughout Champagne, the Champagne region. A lot of them have worldwide distributions and produce some of the best known brands in the world. They'll buy champagne from throughout the region. That's what that NM tells you. If you see an RM, a recultive manipulant, it's a small producer grower. It's someone who grows the grapes and produces the wine. They don't buy grapes from anybody else, and they don't let anybody else make their wines. They control every aspect of wine production, and it must be performed. It has to be produced on the same estate that the grapes are grown on. These are very hard to find outside of the Champagne region, but if you see an RM, some of them make their way here. If you see an RM, it means that one grower controlled all aspects of growing the grapes and producing the wines. If you see a CM, it's a cooperative manipulant. Several growers form a co-op that combine to harvest their grapes. So you may have, 50 different growers They harvest the grapes, and then they hire a winemaker. These 50 growers will hire a winemaker to make the champagne. If you see an RC, a reculant cooperative, the grapes are from a single grower, but he outsources the production of wine to a third party. So if you like a particular village and you like a particular grower, they may not have the facilities to make the wine, but if you see an RC, you know that all of those grapes came from a single vineyard. And then finally, SR, Société de Recoltants, 2 or more growers that form a little corporation among themselves to make the wine. It's a little different than a cooperative. So if you see that little code on a bottle of wine, you'll see that on all of them, and that's what that tells you. So it gives you a little history, a little bit of sense of how that wine was made.